So the United States government says it's considering eligibility for refugee resettlement for what it calls the disfavored ethnic minority Afrikaners in South Africa who are victims of unjust racial discrimination. Follows U.S. President Donald Trump's executive order to resettle Afrikaners in that country after groups like AfriForum and Solidarity met with the U.S. administration asking for intervention after President Cyril Ramaphosa signed the expropriation bill, among others. International relations expert Brooks Spector joins us for more on this. Brooks, a good evening to you. Really good to have you back on the show with us.
Good evening. Good to be with you. A little late tonight. I hope everybody stays awake for this.
Well, you know what? You'd be quite surprised just how late people stay up, especially when you've got so much happening in the country, and also when you know that the country is also being watched by the international community. A lot of interest.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Listen, this is quite the thing. I mean, this refugee status that could possibly be granted to white Afrikaners in South Africa. Recently, an immigration expert saying, well, there is no program in place at the moment. Then you've got the embassy saying that it is working, the U.S. State Department saying it is working with the Department of Homeland Security to implement that executive order. Is that wording, or do you think that the Trump administration is getting closer to actually having that program in place?
Well, I think a couple of things are true. If you remember that the initial executive order announcement was released really very quickly after Donald Trump was inaugurated, and that provoked a whole range of discussion. This most recent announcement really seemed to be something that just said, yes, we're working on it. We'll get to it. We're trying to do what we can do. And keep in mind that there are several different agencies that end up being involved in any version of a visa at this point. Yes, the consulate, thus the State Department, issues the visa, but it has to be vetted. Any visa issuance is vetted by the Department of Homeland Security, which is why that's also mentioned in the various notes. But there hasn't been, at least as far as I could tell, any specific formal documentation that says this is the procedure. This, if you wish to apply, this is what you must do.
Yep.
And one other part of this, of course, is that someone who is applying to be a refugee has to apply through something called the Refugee Admissions Program, which in fact was put on hold at the beginning of the Trump administration when they said they would not accept any more refugees from around the world. So there's more than a little bit of a tangle within the U.S. government at this point on this.
Yeah, I'm keen to then just get your opinion on this, the likelihood that then you are going to see a sort of plan developed, right, in that process actually being developed where there's clear communication. All right, this is where you apply when you've got, refugee statuses, being stopped by the Trump administration at the beginning of his term.
Yeah, I mean, if I were to give advice to people, which I'm not going to do because I don't have the authority to do it, I would tell everyone not to go line up in front of the Consulate General in Johannesburg or the one in Durban or the one in Cape Town just yet if they're really, really interested in this, because there's no formal process for this yet. Anybody can make an application for a visa, whether it's a work visa or a tourist visa or a student visa, and if they meet the criteria, then in the fullness of time, a visa is issued. But this is different than all of those other categories, which means there needs to be a plan that's rooted in law and standard procedures, rather than simply somebody saying, I want to go to the U.S. because I feel persecuted for whatever reason. Please issue me my permit, because the consular officers will look at you with a rather blank face and say, that's not quite how we do this.
Then you've got, I mean, one thing that Trump certainly does is use social media platforms quite a lot, doesn't he? And he says he talks about any farmer with family from South Africa seeking to flee that country for reasons of safety will be invited to the United States of America with a rapid pathway to citizenship. This process will begin immediately. He put this up on Friday on Truth Social. And we don't have to get into the how of it because I think we've touched on that a little bit. You're more than welcome to get into that. But is this his way of speeding up, I suppose, the interactions that he wants to get with South Africa?
Well, it's possible. One of my theories, one of my working theories, is that a whole lot of this discussion and action, although it affects South Africa and South Africans, obviously, a lot of it is in effect aimed at his constituency in America, people who either voted for him or wish they had, and who feel that, like other quote unquote white Americans, they are being looked down upon or being mistreated by all the other people. And the key word here is by the other. And so this particular effort with regard to South Africa, I think is a not very subtle way of reinforcing the idea that he, Donald Trump, is on their side as opposed to all those other people. And one thing that confounds me in all of this, and I talked about this a bit in an article a week or so ago, I am absolutely mystified as to what kind of criteria are going to be brought forward to say you are acceptable under this program, person A, and person B, you are not. I mean, are we going to see people doing this with what, genetic testing, or how are you going to prove that you are a farmer who is an Afrikaner who feels persecuted, other than if somebody simply says that's who they are? What measuring sticks, what process is going to apply? And I pose the not so very fanciful idea. Let's presume somebody who is San or Khoi in origin, who speaks Afrikaans and says, "Look, me, my family, my ancestors, we've been persecuted for what, 400 years. We deserve this too." My mind boggles at how the distinctions and differentiations are going to be made at the point of the consular officer's desk.
Yeah. And just lastly, before I let you go, I mean, there's been a back and forth around whether or not South Africa should send an envoy. The president saying that an envoy certainly will be sent, but the president also wanting to put a trade deal forward to Trump. And then there's the question about AGOA. But I think the final question for me to leave you with is, or for you to leave us with, is the recommendation that you would make to government if you were sitting across the president.
Well, I always think that people discussing things are face to face between roughly equivalent officials. I always think that's useful. I think this shouting that's going on by way of social media or press releases doesn't contribute to a solution. The question of who should go and how should they go, that's going to be enormously consequential. And this is where your embassy in Washington has to have the relationships built up with people in the government and Congress, so that anybody who shows up as an envoy has some way of making contact in a useful and effective way. And it's no good simply saying we're going to send a couple of representatives and they go over there and then somebody tries to get appointments, because, among other things, many of the positions within the new Trump administration that would necessarily deal with African issues or trade with Africa, those people are not yet appointed and confirmed by the Senate, and they're not even named in some cases. Second point to your other statement about a trade deal. For the last number of years, I've been advocating that South Africa and other African countries jointly should be proactive in proposing trade arrangements, reciprocal trade arrangements with the United States, rather than sitting back and waiting for the inevitable decision that Washington makes. And I think that would be a useful thing to do, but how to do it's going to be a rather complex and careful thing to have to plan and graph out. That would be my suggestion, yes.
Yeah, certainly would be quite the statement as well. Brooks, an absolute pleasure chatting to you. Thank you so much for staying up for us as well. Brooks Spector, the international relations expert.